the sky. It's a bird.
It's a plane.
It's
your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
The Human Torch was denied a bank loan. The arsonist has oddly shaped feet. Okay, we're rolling. Here we go. Let's do this.
I love that we just opened with an Anchorman reference.
Yeah, cold opening. We're going old school here. It's going to be awesome.
Did you know I once heard David, I think it's pronounced Koechner, who plays Champ Kind, say that the original idea for Anchorman 2 was to do a Broadway musical instead of a movie because they figured that was the last thing anyone expected. And
it would have been brilliant, and I would have spent all my money going to see that.
That's just it. Like, I'd have flown to New York for the premiere for that. And 110%. It's one of those could have been things, much like Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy 3. Segue.
There it is. Segue. And maybe for volume 3 of Shut Up and Give It to Me, we can do an Anchorman Lost Files edition.
You know, the most disturbing and pathetic part of this whole podcast is that I just turned my head dramatically as I said that for nobody at all in this empty room that I'm sitting in.
Well, we've said all along, you've got a face for podcasting, Jake.
I'm getting the body language down, that's for sure.
Yeah, and even if people couldn't see it, because, you know, we don't have that capability yet with podcasts, I bet they could feel it. Like, the energy was rich. It was organic. It was in the moment. You committed. You made a bold choice as a performer. And I feel like you are helping our listeners emote currently as we speak. And that is no small thing.
No, not at all a small thing. You know, it's just one of many valuable services I provide.
You're a Swiss Army knife.
So yeah, Hellboy.
Speaking of Swiss Army knives, let's transition to Hellboy. Okay, so there is a lot. There's a lot going on here, and I think it's safe to assume, Jake, I'm going to go ahead and take a leap here. I think it's safe to assume that you and I both are on the Hellboy bandwagon. Like, we are both pro Hellboy. And so this episode in a lot of ways has been a long time coming, because it's something that you and I could easily talk about, be passionate about it, and not feel like we need to be careful about ragging on it too much, because if anything, we're just going to gush because we just think the concept of Hellboy is really cool. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would go so far as to say that Hellboy is one of my very favorite indie comics characters for a variety of reasons. There's an emotional attachment because Hellboy is one of the first true indie characters out there that I really latched onto. I also just love, one thing I'm going to keep coming back to is just the art of Mike Mignola, who created Hellboy, and who does the art in most of the comics. I've really just always loved this character, and I liked the Del Toro films. I am equally psyched for the new one starring David Harbour, and I got real excited when Mitch pitched this episode to me, everybody. So I am all in on Hellboy.
I'm all in too. We're doing this now. I do have to say, I was a little apprehensive about the Dave Harbour, Neil Marshall interpretation. Not necessarily that I was worried about it like being good, or that they were out of real estate to choose from, because there's a good Hellboy canon that you can pick from. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I just, every once in a while there's one of those moments where you have like both a connection to a character and a perfect team of creators and performer and everything. And I just felt like, as far as comic book movies are concerned and specific characters, it's really difficult for me to go through the modern canon of what we've had over the last 20 years and find a better pairing of Guillermo del Toro visualizing Hellboy with Ron Perlman in that character.
Well, and what's interesting about it is that for so many people, and I will admit myself included, the Guillermo del Toro films were the gateway to the character of Hellboy. And that's so fascinating because del Toro's vision of Hellboy is, I don't want to say it's totally different than the original, but I'd say it's adjacent to it. It's certainly not the same as what Mike Mignola ended up creating across the comics over the decades. But it's also not so radically different that it's unrecognizable. But there are certainly elements of the character that are surprising in print. And I say all that to say, Del Toro really did put his own spin on the character. He really did truly interpret Hellboy for a different medium. And I think that ultimately that's, to me, what I'm going to miss the most. And it's also, interestingly enough, what I'm most excited to move on from. And so I'm in a really weird position with this reboot where I loved Del Toro's reimagining. I thought it was great, and I thought that it worked so well to be distinct from the comics. But I'm so psyched to see what is, from all appearances, going to be a more comics accurate interpretation on the screen too.
And that's ultimately what is really fueling my hope for the new one. But like you said, I think this may be the first time you and I have, at least for the sake of this podcast, dished on something in this particular way, whereas you and I weren't introduced, at least to the concept of Hellboy, through the comic books. It was the way around, which is because we both were introduced through the movies from Guillermo del Toro and Ron Perlman. So it's really interesting to both such huge fans of the comic book medium and be approaching it as people that say, okay, we came in through the movies first. And that's just not typically something that happens when you're dealing with our level of fandom and the level of fandom that a lot of our listeners have, which I just find interesting. I'm not sure if that maybe helps us be a little bit more, I guess maybe I'm not a little bit more taking ownership of like of the movie side of things, but maybe it's just because the comic run is so good that it's possible to have both. I think you addressed something really interesting about how Del Toro did a really good job of creating something that was both original but still familiar at the same time. And in the realm of comics, that seems to be a massive landmine, right? It's kind of like, oh man, I've got it's like I got a big old turd in my Happy Meal. That's no bueno at all. But for whatever reason, it seemed to work in this playground, and a lot of people seem to forgive him for that and allow him the agency to do that. At the same time, there's still an awful lot of good buzz about the upcoming Hellboy movie, and it seems to be one of the few instances where we're getting a quote-unquote reboot, but people on the internet aren't completely ragging on the previous iterations that came first. It's like this may be the only instance everyone can just kind of universally agree, at least as far as Twitter is concerned, the barren wasteland that it is. It's like everyone can at least agree. It's like, yeah, cool. Incarnation 1 of Hellboy, Incarnation Hellboy, or Incarnation 2 of Hellboy. Great. I can have both. Let's be happy in the sandbox.
Yeah, it's definitely got this. I feel like it's a combination of just lovable people has made this possible, because I don't know that any director working in film today more makes me want to go up and hug them than Guillermo del Toro. And that has nothing to do with his work. There's just something about him that he just looks like a cuddly dude.
He is. And everyone that works with him just says that he is, despite his unique brand of creativity and he calls it a love of monsters, he is like the most gentle genius that a lot of people seem to have worked with in the horror.
Yeah, and it's that, and it's like, Ron Perlman, who I've discussed before that, like, for some reason I jump to Ron Perlman for a ton of roles when I think about him, and I just really, Ron Perlman's got, I don't know what it is about him, but he's got kind of that can do no wrong thing going. And then, coming in from the other end, you've got David Harbour, whose stock is really high just because of Stranger Things, but you also add in his online presence where the guy is willing to do anything for fans. And he's just this really likable dude who's created this very, really likable persona for himself online. And all of that kind of came together to create something that I think, and I say this half jokingly and half really seriously, something that I think we truly need right now, which is just something that everyone can be happy with. Old fans, new fans, everything in between. It just seems like this is the perfect thing. This is and man, I know I'm putting a lot on a movie that I don't know a ton about yet, but I feel really good about the culture around this thing right now.
Completely agree with you. And before we dive in headfirst into the 2019 iteration of Hellboy, I do want to touch on a couple of things with the first two installments that we were given. The first movie is good. I wouldn't classify it as anything better than good. It is a good comic book movie in every sense of the term. But I've got to say, Hellboy 2: The Golden Army is not only one of the few instances in cinema where a sequel is better than the original, but I have it on my short list of like one of the best dozen sequels maybe made since the 70s. And I know that both may sound like a hot take and also not like a lukewarm take, because so many sequels are awful. But at the same time, if you really think about the good ones, like the types of sequels that are really worth mentioning, like Godfather Part 2, Back to the Future Part 2, Batman Returns, these types of movies. Like I Ghostbusters 2, not necessarily better than the original, but Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, all of these types of movies. Like anytime I talk about those, I find my mind wanting to make sure that I include Hellboy 2, because Hellboy 2 just seems to be one of the few instances where I remember having both such unbridled entertainment and raw awe for visualization. At the same time, I was having a few visceral emotional experiences throughout the movie as well. And by 2008, we hadn't had very many iterations of that in the comic book cinematic world. Like V for Vendetta really caught my eye, and Dark Knight was great, but Dark Knight wasn't great because it was super emotional and relatable, but there's just something about Hellboy 2: The Golden Army. I wanted to give it a little bit of playing space in the spotlight here while we were doing this, because it's our friggin' podcast and we can. Yeah, get it. Oh, it's my podcast and I'm doing what I want. But I don't know what I guess I'm saying this to say that I love both movies, but Hellboy 2: The Golden Army has a very special place in my heart, and I want to hear what you think about the two.
Well, I mean, Hellboy 2 is definitely the better film. Like, I don't want to mince words about that. And that's nothing to say. That's nothing to be derogatory to the original Hellboy movie. But I think it was a combination of factors that ultimately led to, if I can be bold enough to speculate about a set that I was not on, I got the vibe that in Hellboy 2, there had been a variety of factors where comic book movies were being taken more seriously. Guillermo del Toro had gone on to really earn his stripes there, not just as a beloved cult guy, but as a beloved director across the board. And I think that it feels like with number 2, they kind of let del Toro run wild, and they let him have his fun, and they let him really take the character and explore it in the way he wanted to. And while Hellboy 1 is distinctly del Toro-ish, Hellboy 2 even more so. Hellboy 2 really is where he put his mark on that franchise and created that unique take on the character that we're talking about.
And what I find so interesting about that too is the timing. So
yeah,
Hellboy 1 came in 2004 and Hellboy 2 came in 2008. And sandwiched in the middle of that, serving as the deliciously wonderful, not so artificial cream of the Oreo in the middle of those two movies, was this little movie in 2006 called Pan's Labyrinth. Mm-hmm. Now, depending on which cinephile you talk to, you're going to hear different opinions. This particular cinephile with the microphone right now is going to say Pan's Labyrinth was the best movie of 2006, deserved the Oscar, and Guillermo del Toro deserved to win Best Director that year. And yes, I recognize that dethroned Martin Scorsese, one of my all-time favorites, from winning his beloved Oscar. But let's be real, anybody that follows Scorsese's career knows that he won for the wrong movie. It was just a it's about time type of thing. And they weren't ready to anoint del Toro yet. But Pan's Labyrinth is I say for sure top 10, if not top 5 best movies of the 21st century made so far. I'm comfortable saying that right now. And that really put him on the map as an auteur instead of just a gimmicky visual type storyteller. And Hellboy 2 is a wonderful mix of the two things that he excels at, because Hellboy 1 is that popcorn flick that's got the great visuals and you're like, this is the right kind of campy. I'm so glad I'm here. And it's got a very unique tone that's consistent. Pan's Labyrinth is, holy crap, I just watched something really, really heavy and mind-bending and creative at this, feeling a lot of things, and I need to stew on it for 2 days before I talk to anybody else. Hellboy 2 is a wonderful marriage of the two, where you're getting a celebration of this comic book world. You're getting a very stereotypical type of story of this prince rebelling against the order because he has a difference in philosophy from the old way of doing things. And Hellboy's trying to do the right thing, but maybe he understands where the bad guys are coming from. And it's this thing we've seen time and time again, but with the subtle storytelling and characterization and few framing moments of humanistic tendencies that he really breathed into life. Like when I think about the big plant sequence, the way the plant dies, and at spoiler alert, the big plant dies at the end of the first 20 minutes. And the Angel of Death scene, which remains one of the greatest single scenes I've ever seen in cinema that Guillermo del Toro has produced. There are just so many like key emotional moments. When the twin sister stabs herself, all of these are moments that you understand and you know that they would belong in a story like this, but they are so organic and so earned, even though they're inside such a fantastical world, that I find myself having these deep reflective thoughts and feeling incredibly profound things while I'm still enjoying a Hellboy movie. And I think Hellboy 2 is both kind of underappreciated and kind of forgotten because it came out at the same time that Dark Knight did, and was before this really huge renaissance of the oversaturation of comic book movies and even bigger budgets. But I feel like Hellboy 2 deserves placement in the upper echelon of the pantheon of comic book movies. And I feel like it's a wonderful blend of the two types of filmmaking that Del Toro really excels in. And he married the two perfectly with this one title. I was just talking for a really long time. Now you go.
No, I think you nailed it. It is just, I do again. I always want to give some credit to the original Hellboy, because I remember a teacher in high school asking me if I had seen that movie and if it was good, and I said, yeah, I did see it. I'm not sure why I liked it so much. I said, I can definitely tell you it's the best movie about giant Nazi space squids you're going to see this year. And I really enjoyed it. But
it's kind of like Sylvester Stallone's Over the Top. When anybody sees it, you're like,
it's about arm wrestling?
Easily the best arm wrestling truck driving movie I've ever seen.
That's exactly right. And I tried to, and that's the thing about the first Hellboy, is I used to really abuse that line when people would talk to me about it. And then I reached a point where I was like, all right, people think I'm being a smart aleck about this. They think I don't like this movie. So I kind of backed off on it. I really enjoyed it. But no, number 2 is definitely a grossly underrated comic book film. I don't know where I would place it, honestly. If you made me, someday I'm going to have to just like write it down and look at it. But if gun to my head, you made me make a list of best comic book films, I'm comfortable saying that Golden Army probably is in the top 10. It's probably number 9 or number 10. But again, I don't have the list in front of me to say that for sure. Maybe at the end of the day, it comes up higher than I think. But
I've been slowly working on that list in my head the last couple of weeks in preparation for our upcoming episode for the different eras that we're going to talk about. And I've little bit of teaser on this. I've been having to separate things out between like what we call hero or superhero movies and comic book movies, because then I get down this rabbit hole for movies like Road to Perdition, which is technically based on a graphic novel, and A History of Violence, which are both like Oscar contending films. And I'm like, oh, I want to put those at the top, but it doesn't really pertain to what we've been talking about when we talk about Hellboy and spandex and capes, you know. but I'm right there with you. I think Hellboy 2: The Golden Army is at least in my top 10, if not my top 7. It's got to be, at least anecdotally, that's where I'm placing it right now. But not to squash on the first one. I think the first one is an incredible first chapter for everything that they were establishing. But man, I feel like Hellboy 2 kind of came out of nowhere for how just well-roundedly awesome it was in just about every conceivable way. If anyone wants to deep dive into this concept a little bit more, if you're not familiar with the Film School Rejects or One Perfect Shot website, they did a really good piece on it that they rerun every once in a while on Twitter and stuff, but you can find it. If you go to the One Perfect Shot or Film School Rejects website, you can just go into their search bar and search for Hellboy 2, and you'll see this really good piece about why it's one of the best comic book movies and maybe Guillermo's best movie. It's a good write.
Yeah, I may have to go track that down now. So I think Hellboy 1 is surprisingly good when put in context. It is sneaky. It came in, and I think that it really was one of the best examples of that era of comic book film. And then Hellboy 2 is, it's just an underrated classic. So I was among those that wanted to see a conclusion to the trilogy. I did want to see Del Toro's version of Hellboy reach the end of his journey, because in the comics we've seen now, just in the last couple of years, Mignola's comic book Hellboy has reached the end of his journey. And I was really curious to see where Del Toro would take that. And I'm sad we're not going to get to see where Del Toro would have taken it, but I also know that Guillermo del Toro is this guy that is constantly taking on more projects than any human could possibly do. And I felt like if he agreed to do it, or if they announced it was happening, it would just be a terrible tease anyway, because by the time he got around to doing it, Ron Perlman would, be old enough that it would, it'd show through makeup and whatever. And, I just didn't think that it was going to be able to be done in a timely manner. So I get the reboot. I understand the desire for the reboot.
Yeah, Del Toro's production list between what he produces and helps write and helps direct and what he's got in development and stuff is just insane.
Yeah.
The dude is busy, and I get it. He's good at what he does, so that's what you do. So, Jake, like we talked about, we're kind of at this really weird stage where the comic book lore, especially online, is just makes a living on being polarizing and making you pick sides and stand in a camp and all that sort of stuff. But Hellboy seems to be writing both, where we can appreciate what Del Toro gave us, and we can also eagerly look forward to what we are going to get. So let's launch forward. 2019, we are going to get a Hellboy movie. It is going to star David Harbour, be directed by Neil Marshall, and like the other movies, it's got really good casting. Mila Jovovich is in it, Sasha Lane, who I absolutely love. If you haven't seen the movie American Honey, check it out. Ian McShane, Daniel Day Kim, Penelope Mitchell, Brian Gleason. These are some solid people, not necessarily A-listers all across the board, but people that have chops, people that have talent, and people that have enough of a reputation to know that they can swim with David in this movie here. So break it down for me. What are your initial thoughts going into the limited stuff that we have seen?
Okay, so I don't know how I could really give this conversation any justice without going a little bit into spoilers for the comics. If you're interested in catching up on Hellboy comics, there are some spoilers coming, but at the same time, I am comfortable giving that a soft warning and saying that Hellboy is more about the journey than the destination, and say that, the story is told out of chronological order anyway, so you don't necessarily need to be afraid of the spoiler, but just so it's been put out there, we're going to discuss some elements from the comics that some would consider spoilery. So that being said, there's a really strong indication, not just indication. I mean, they've outright said what comics are influencing it. But it looks like they're going to really.
Isn't it Storm and the Fury, The Wild Hunt, and Darkness Calls? Are those the three that they're really going to borrow
Nailed
from?
it.
Okay.
Yes. And those are the three.
I did my homework.
Yeah, those are the three trades that they're really drawing from a lot. That they tell. The thing about Hellboy's story is that it becomes a very it becomes kind of a mythology of its own, because Mignola will do these things where he will go off and do he's a lot like Guillermo del Toro, actually, and I think that might be why the two of them worked so well together on the Hellboy films, where he'll start on a project and then just let his imagination take him somewhere. So those trades kind of start to gather some of the threads from what up to that point had been a sort of a really enjoyable ride, but not a real cohesive one. Hellboy stories would suddenly you're 50 years in the past, suddenly you're in modern times. You'd get a story where he's left the BPRD, he's off wandering, he's in Mexico killing luchador vampires, and it would just kind of wander all over. Right, man. And by the way, awesome comic. And it just kind of wanders, and then these three trades really start to bring the story together. And they ultimately culminate. They lead to the end of Hellboy's story is Hellboy does, and these are the spoilers, Hellboy dies, but that's not the end of the story. When he dies, he goes to right. When he dies, he goes to hell, and then we get the Hellboy in Hell finale, which again, Mignola kind of doing his own thing, was gonna run a lot longer than it did, and I guess Mignola one day with just like 3 issues. I think he was on like issue 9, and he suddenly said, I'm going to do 3 more of these. And then I think, it's time for this character to be done. And, there's still some Hellboy stories being told. There's stuff, but really that key Hellboy story, his arc from being the beast of the apocalypse who refuses to be the beast of the apocalypse, the beginning of the end is represented in these comics. I say all that to say that there's some really... If you're going to draw from the comics more directly, there's 2 ways you can go. You can go the way the original Hellboy did and focus on that origin story with Rasputin and killing Professor, it starts with a B. He was played by John Hurt. And he's going to be Ian McShane in the new one, I think, and I just cannot remember his name because it's tough to pronounce. Brutenholm. Professor Brutenholm.
Trevor Brutenholm.
Yes. And so you can go 2 routes. You can go the Brutenholm's death and the origin of Hellboy and all that stuff, or you can come in on the other end where they start to gather up the mythology, and you can start with Hellboy going through these stories. And so I think this is a really interesting way of taking it. I'm fascinated by some of the clues we see here. Mila, what?
Can I jump in really quick and just say
Please.
Something that's not at all pertinent?
Yeah.
Ian McShane is on my short list of like top 3 choices of anybody to narrate the movie of my life or to voice anything going on in the movie of my life, because I just freaking love his voice.
Did you watch American Gods at all, the first season of it?
No, haven't dove into it yet. I don't have stars. Is it on a streamable of any kind?
It must be, because I saw it somehow, but I don't have stars either, so I don't know how I did that.
Okay, I wonder if it's on Hulu or Amazon or something. I'll check it out. But
it's got to be on something.
I love his voice. The dude can just do whatever he wants with his voice, and it's both like raspy, but also like comfortable in a grandpa sort of way, but also like the edgy grandpa who's kind of like Sam Elliott meets Hell's Angels. I don't know. He's just legit.
He's so good. I bring that up because he's so good as Mr. Wednesday in American Gods. Just little reference, something comics adjacent. Neil Gaiman wrote it.
Unless we forget Tai Lung in Kung Fu Panda.
Yes. Yeah. So good. I love Kung Fu Panda.
I do too. Unashamed.
No, Mila, is it? I always say it wrong. Jovovich.
Jovovich is a soft J.
Gotcha.
Maybe a soft J.
Well, I think I always start saying yo-yo, and then I mess it up. Yo-Yovich. So Jovovich, Mila's
Lilu from The Fifth Element.
There we go. Mila's role is an interesting one because she's Nemu the Blood Queen, or Nemu. I don't know how to pronounce that one because I've only ever read it. Which is it sounds like it might be a fusion of two characters, or it might be just a renamed other character. They're going to bring in the Baba Yaga, which is the Russian witch who lives in a house that has chicken legs, which is like one of Hellboy's ultimate villains, interestingly enough. She's like one of his arch enemies that's out to get him always. And there's so many bits of that Hellboy mythology being pulled in that I'm thinking this movie is going to get a little bit dense, and that might not be a bad thing. But I think they're going to give us a lot of lore and a lot of mythology to sift through here. And I think both the challenge and the opportunity of this film is going to be distilling that in a way where we get the sense and we understand that this world is bigger than what we're going to see in the 2 hours that we live in it. But we're also not going to be so inundated with that and hit over the head with it that we lose track of what's going on in the film we're watching.
And I'm encouraged by that to a certain extent. Obviously, especially in comic book movies, you're always flirting with the realm of biting off too much more than you can chew. But at the same time, like especially with the lineage stories that they're going to be borrowing this from, the stories from Mingola, they take place between the two worlds. Like it's both the supernatural and actual narrative. And so basically what I'm getting at is there's a lot of background, there's a lot of world building, and there's an awful lot of stuff that needs to go into making key moments and key characters feeling lived in. And in order to earn those types of moments, and in order for us to be willing to go on those sorts of journeys, we've got to be able to do that world building. You've got to be able to introduce this mythology. You've got to be able to allude things that are obviously deeper, more complex, that don't necessarily get complete justifications, but make sense in the sense that you are explaining there is something greater evolving around, that's orbiting around everyone else, because this is a world that they're living in. There's a certain degree of that I think is important. I don't want them to go too far to a point where they feel like they're just rushing stuff and it's a movie that needed some script cleanup. But at the same time, all the really good ones have enough of the world building in there that you know that there's more stuff that could have been explored more, but there wasn't, but that it's there. Does that make sense? Like you've got to be able to establish certain stuff in order for this stuff to feel lived in order for it to feel actual enough that you're actually going to have an emotional journey and an attachment to the people that you're following for a while.
Well, I always take it back to the original Star Wars, and the way that it teased us so well with so many other things. And there was, just from the number of creatures walking around, so many different worlds out there we knew. And yet you really only see 2 planets in the whole thing and a Death Star. And the story stays very focused on these people, but there's this whole mythology about the Clone Wars and about Jedi and all this stuff. And it creates this huge galaxy, this world that is so lived in and has so much history, but it doesn't require us to understand all of it. It just teases us with it. And to me, that's always the ultimate example of world building done effectively. And I think that it's going to need to be a very fine line with Hellboy, because more so than so many, and a lot, every story revolves around characterization. That's not news, but the Hellboy stories really hinge on the characterization of Hellboy himself, and on him being so likable in spite of what he is and who he is, and him being this, there's this, and this is why I love Mignola's art so much. There's this sadness to the character, this melancholy. And in the very first panel you ever look at, it's just, there's this weight to it where this guy is got something coming for him and he doesn't want it. And he's this guy that all he really wants is just a normal life, but by definition of who he is, he can't have it. And that very personal, very intimate character study has to be at the heart of Hellboy. But in order to bring in all of these characters I'm looking at on here, you have got to have a deep mythology if you're going to do them justice, even if you're not going to directly translate them, which they don't have to. But to do justice to those characters and to those stories, there's got to be that deep mythology. So it's going to be a very fine line between the intimate character study and the much bigger world building that has to happen.
And I think that they're definitely alluding to that a little bit more too, with some of the pictures that have been posted so far. Like if you check out the IMDb page and everything like that, like there's a black and white image of this Hellboy in the trench coat, but you can tell that he's got kind of like that weighty look on him, where you can tell he's a touch weathered, he's determined and he's gritty, but you can tell that he's weathered, and you can just sense that he's carrying something heavier. And that's clearly completely different than the approach for Perlman that Perlman was written for, because that one was a lot more of sarcasm and trying to use use sarcasm as a coping mechanism to deal with the differences and everything. But this Hellboy that Mignola talks about, that we're hopefully going to see in this movie, like you said, is dealing with that concept of like, he can see exactly what a regular life could look like and should feel like, and has brushes with moments against that. And that's part of the struggle, because it would be easier to ride that off as something you can't have if it's something you've never really actually tasted or something you don't really want very much of. He clearly thirsts for it, and because of the way he looks, he's not able to do it. And that, as campy as that may sound, that is clearly something to be a key motivating factor that underlies most of what Harbour's directing or acting choices are going to be made, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's, and I'm glad that you brought up that black and white picture, because I'm also looking at it right now, and it's definitely my favorite promotional image that's come out yet. And I like them. I like, there's a pretty cool illustrated poster. There's the first one that we saw of him in the shadows, but this black and white one carries with it, like you said, that weight. And I look at it and I see David Harbour's Hellboy has all those things. And and I always felt like the trench coat that he wears, the duster jacket, whatever you want to call it, was this, like, I don't know, it felt to me like he was trying to evoke this private eye thing with the BPRD, and like he was trying to get this life that you talked about that he knows he can't have, but he wants it. And it was him trying to be normal for him and trying to be just human for him. And it's so fascinating of a character. And I say all that to bring us full circle with Mignola's art, and his writing are always so, the word minimalist can get abused sometimes, ironically. But is it ironic or is it poetic just? Anyway, but it can
self-aware.
Self-aware. But I really feel like Mignola says so much with so little, and he conveys so much with the art, and with sometimes what's not happening, or sometimes with just a look on a character that doesn't even have pupils, And I look at this black and white David Harbour picture, and I see a lot of characterization being communicated with that picture. And it really, really excites me for the possibilities here. So I'm so glad you referenced that. So glad you brought it up.
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the key tipping points is if you obviously the legitimacy of the source material they're working from is as good as any comic book movie is going to have for source material. Mignola's run of Hellboy, phenomenal. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm questioning that, but, and maybe this is just stating the obvious and maybe I should just shut up, but clearly one of the biggest, the tipping point for what is going to make this movie successful and stand alone, and not necessarily leave the first two Hellboy movies in its dust, but just to be able to stand in its own arena and say, here's what we have established here, is going to be how clearly can they dictate and communicate the different characterization for Harbor's Hellboy. Because obviously the supporting cast is great. Like Sophie Okonedo was in this movie. She's a theatrically award-winning actress and a Golden Globe nominated actress. Like she's bringing her chops in a supporting role. Like Shane, Sasha Lane and Mila Jovovich. Like, the supporting cast is going to be there and they're going to bring heat. And we know the visuals are going to be fine because it's got the budget to be great. But is Marshall going to give Harbor the right kind of writing and the right kind of space to be creative and explore the different types of characterization that Hellboy needs to have on the screen in order for it to be distinct, to be its own, and to be able to say, okay, we can follow this version into this new world that you have built, instead of him either feeling stunted and not getting enough to play to his strengths, like what we saw with Tom Hardy in Venom, or to have moments where it just looks like he's trying to channel Ron Perlman. I don't want that at all, because part of the reason Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker was so strong was because it couldn't have been any more different than Jack Nicholson, and you can't tell me that wasn't a common ingredient behind why it was so mythic, so it's just, again, maybe, but I guess ultimately what I'm saying is I really want to see that rich and distinctly different characterization for Hellboy. And I just, at least for me, that's what the movie hinges on, because I know the source material is great. I know the cast is great. And I know that the visuals are going to be great. So the way they allowed themselves to write for Hellboy, is that going to be a good enough playground for Harbor to be featured and for it to be strong enough for us to say, okay, I can follow this guy for the next run of movies?
I think that's a really good question, because I'm going to confess to my ignorance here. I don't know a ton about Neil Marshall. I've been looking at his resume here in prep, and then again while we've been talking, and I see that he's directed a couple episodes of Game of Thrones, pretty good episodes if memory serves. He's done a lot of good television stuff. But at the same time, TV is, being part of a TV series is a different beast. And I just don't know enough about him that I can definitively say I believe in him, I don't believe in him. And so I've been forced to really lean into my understanding of the other people involved in this project to really get an idea for how I think it's going to go. Do you have any insight into Neil Marshall or?
Yeah, so if you run through, he did the movie Doomsday, which is kind of has a cult following. It's not bad. But it's all right. But he did a couple of episodes of Constantine and Hannibal and Westworld and Game of Thrones and Black Sails and Lost in Space. All of those could be classified as prestige TV, at least in the sense of the big budgets that those shows had and the kinds of audiences they drew, even if the shows were short run. All of them were pretty well critically acclaimed and have massive followings and carried big budgets. So he knows what it's like to live in the world of prestige TV. He knows what it's like to live in the world of things that would get featured at Comic-Con, is ultimately what I'm getting at too, because Westworld, Game of Thrones, those types of things get lumped in with Comic-Con as well. So he's there and he knows how to do it. So basically, I'm just led to believe this. He clearly knows what it's like to work with relatively big budgets. He knows what it's like to be working in the fantastical world and to think outside the box and to have to rely on both good production value and good special effects at the same time. Other than that, it may just be, taking a chapter out of Marvel's book. And we've talked about this multiple times on this podcast with sometimes the best decisions for launching something new in this fantastical type of a realm is to take a chance on somebody that is still, quote unquote, a little unproven in this arena, but trust their vision, trust their creativity, give them the resources they need to do it well. And then you can be, pleasantly surprised that you then land on something like the Russo brothers. Because before Captain America, the Winter Soldier, did you really know the Russo brothers? The answer would be no. And same thing with Waititi. with Thor Ragnarok. You know what I mean? Like some of these folks, David Ayer in Suicide Squad is maybe a bad example, but it was the same type of thing where he was only known in a couple of circles, and then there was them taking their big chance on him. And there are some people that love Suicide Squad, and there are a lot of people that don't. But, it's just that may be kind of a way where you remove any chance of having a Zack Snyderism or a Martin Scorseseism or a Steven Spielbergism, where you have such a heavy tone in auteurism that's being brought with the helmer of the project that you can't help but see it through the lens of, I'm watching a Martin Scorsese movie that has Hellboy in it, instead of saying, I'm watching a Hellboy movie.
I think you just sold me on him as the director is what happened. Like, I think that I went from ambivalent to excited about his involvement. I also, just because I can't really contribute anything useful, he's British. And so, there's some King Arthur stuff going on in here. Yeah. So there we go.
It's a great start. So Jake, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most excited you've been in a long time, rate for me how much you are looking forward to Hellboy 2019.
I'm actually going to go 10 on this, and that's saying something because next year is going to be stacked. It's going to be, we're getting Captain Marvel, we're getting Avengers 4, we're getting Hellboy,
Wonder Woman 84.
Wonder Woman 84. Is the new Spider-Man next year, or is that the year after?
Ooh, great question. Say something while I look it up.
I think they're filming it right now, because I definitely saw, I believe I saw some production pictures on Twitter.
Yep, July 2019.
Nice. All right.
Spider-Man Far From Home.
So I mean, it's going to be a great year for comic book films. We're going to be very busy. We are not going to be lacking for content on this show. And of all of those things, Spider-Man's my favorite. I am thrilled for Captain Marvel. I've been huge into that project from day one. I need to know how Avengers wraps up, but I think I'm most excited for Hellboy. And I'm really excited for this movie. I cannot wait for this movie.
Oh, man, you launched Hellboy in front of Spidey.
I did. Well, here's the thing. I think Spider-Man, if I'm being honest, and I've made no secret of my love for Spider-Man Homecoming, I also think that we know what we're getting with Spider-Man. And True. I'm thrilled for it, but there's an element of excitement over the unknown with Hellboy.
There's less anticipatory.
Yeah. And the other thing is also, much as I love the Marvel films, much as I have, tended to lean a little more towards Marvel through my life, Marvel is, like I said, with Spider-Man, Marvel's a known quantity. And those other three movies are all Marvel films. And then you get Wonder Woman, which is going to be different from that. But I think for me, it's nice to be excited about something that doesn't fall into the MCU and then, or to something directly adjacent to it in the form of the DCEU. And so to me, there's something really thrilling about that indie comic vibe that's going on with Hellboy.
I'm right there with you. I'm not sure if I'm at level 10, but I'm at least at level like 8.5, 9 for this movie. And I'll see it opening weekend. It'll be great. And it opens the day before my daughter's birthday. So, I mean, that's
nice.
Kind of cool too. Yeah. So there you go.
There you go. So take Sophia to see her first R-rated movie.
I should. Why not? I'm a good dad. She'll be turning 3 the next day. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah, she won't remember it. If it scars her, whatever, I mean, that's a therapist's problem, man.
She's going to end up in therapy anyway. I might as well give her some good fodder for it. Okay, so Hellboy, we're doing it. We're excited. It's going to be awesome. Hit us up on the Twitters if you have any hot takes about Hellboy, or if you haven't checked out the Mignola's work that this movie is going to be based on, you definitely should hit it up and let us know what you think about it, because obviously Jake and I are both huge fans. Again, major shout out to the GeekDad Podcast Network, because we love them and they love us, and it was a wonderful family to be a part of. But yeah, we will be getting with you next week with some more really cool, awesome stuff.
And see you then.
This podcast has been a production of the GeekDad Podcast Network. If you've enjoyed this content, please consider supporting us at patreon.com/geekdad.